I gotta tell somebody.
This is the best thing I've ever seen.
That. Let's talk about that.
You need this. Listen to this.
Memorable and exciting.
Well, then be less boring.
I'm going to tell everyone. Wait here.
Mighty remarkable, Big Daddy.
Remarkable.
Welcome to Remarkable, a podcast for B2B marketers that deconstructs the most iconic moments in film, television, pop culture, and advertising for a single purpose: to give you, the B2B marketer, the same storytelling techniques that the pros use. In each episode, you will learn techniques from Hollywood, Pixar, Marvel, and beyond, from Spielberg's hands to yours, bringing remarkable content ideas to you every single week. I'm Ian Faison, CEO of Caspian Studios. This is Remarkable. This week, we're talking about B2B marketing lessons from Miles Davis' album, Kind of Blue, with the help of our special guest, Director of Content and Web at Heap, Ben Lempert.
Machines on. No title. Take one. Here we go.
Wait a
CO
minute.
62-291. Number 2. Take
Wait
one.
1 minute.
It is one of the single greatest achievements in recorded music.
It's a cornerstone record, not only for jazz, it's a cornerstone record for music.
Doo-ding, boo-dee-doo-dee, boo-doo.
It's sort of like, the Bible in a way. You just have one in your house. I think I have about 3 copies. I got the records, the albums, real albums.
Ben, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
Excited to have you on the show. Excited to chat jazz, which we've never done on the show. And who better than you, a trained jazz musician? And we'll get into all of that. We'll get into marketing at Heap and real deep into Miles Davis. Why the heck did you pick Kind of Blue?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I will say I'm also super thrilled to be here talking about one of my favorite things in the world, which is music and jazz in particular. I chose Kind of Blue for a number of reasons. First, it is just frankly one of the most beautiful musical statements of the last 75 years, since World War II at least.
It's poignant. It's beautiful.
A door opening.
Absolute bliss.
A spiritual, religious thing.
A holy calling.
Kind of Blue felt like it was made in heaven.
Jazz is one of America's great gifts to the world. I think jazz is a music that could only have been born on American soil. I think it is one of the moments when lots and lots of elements that make the music we call jazz such an amazing art form really come together at a super high level in a very aesthetically balanced way. So it's just a wonderful musical statement. I also think it's interesting because it is one of the very few jazz records that most people who are not jazz fans own and listen to actively. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. And I think that gives us a pretty interesting lens for thinking about how content works, given that lots of content is directed towards people who may not be aware of the intricacies of your technical solutions, but still want to be compelled by what you have to say and want to be interested in it. So I think there are lessons there about why Kind of Blue works so successfully as something that even non-active jazz fans really listen to often and cherish. And third, on the aesthetic level, Kind of Blue manages a kind of aesthetic balancing act that very few art forms do, and that it really balances simplicity versus complexity, minimalism versus maximalism, spontaneity versus composition in a way that few artworks do. And I think is the sort of artwork that allows for lots of different individual voices to be captured at once, which is also something I think good content does.
I should also say, you're no slouch. This is not just, a hobby for you. You actually studied this as a PhD and play jazz.
That's true. So my professional path has been slightly unconventional. I grew up in San Francisco, and after college at UC Berkeley, I moved to New York essentially to try and be a jazz musician. I ended up going to music school at the New School in New York, which was a really wonderful experience. I got to just hang out and learn from and play with so many masters of the music and also a bunch of other students who were deeply committed. And, there were months where I would spend 8 or 9 hours in the practice room every day being very intense about this, and then would go to a jam session at night and play with people. And I did that through most of my 20s. And I ended up playing not just jazz, but lots of different kinds of music. Of course, I played rock and I played Brazilian music and I played experimental music. And one of the more successful things I did was play guitar in this Nigerian band that toured up and down the East Coast, which was also a blast. It's not quite jazz, but there were 15 people on stage. And the goal of that was just to get people dancing for 2 or 3 hours. And that was a really wonderful experience. And then the joke I tell is that I made so much money as a jazz musician that I had to do something else that would make me less money. So I quit my highly lucrative life as a jazz musician in New York. But that's a big joke. And moved back to California and got a PhD from UC Berkeley in literature and philosophy. And my dissertation was about American poetry and jazz, and was about a group of different American poets, some of whom are famous, some of whom are less famous, who tried to employ jazz less as a set of sounds to imitate in their poetry, but sort of conceptual approach to making art, and brought that into their poetry in lots of different interesting ways. And in the process, had interesting things to say about art and identity and race and America. The short answer is I spent a lot of my life thinking about this music and playing it and listening to it. And I still think it's an incredibly deep well for me.
And now you get to bring all of that to a podcast to talk about the marketing lessons. Not quite the culmination, I don't think, but still important nonetheless.
My whole life has been channeling to this moment. Yes, definitely.
That's right. It all leads here. All roads lead back to Caspian in some form or another. So you now are the director of content and web at Heap. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've been at Heap almost 5 years. It has grown and changed a lot in the time I've been there. It's tripled in size. We've brought numerous new products to market. We've gone up market. Heap in general is a product analytics solution, which means that it gives teams who build digital experiences, whether those are digital products or e-commerce websites or any sort of offering a company gives across desktop or mobile, or even we can work with IoT. It gives you analytics about how people navigate the experience you've built. So what they click on, where they go, what paths they take through your site, whether you're aware of them or not. It's crucial information for building a better digital experience, which we all know how many websites suck and are just impossible to navigate and make no sense. And we give teams information that helps build better things on the internet.
Meredith, what the heck is Kind of Blue?
So we are going back to 1959. It's March 2nd, and 7 musicians are showing up at Columbia Studio on 30th Street in Manhattan.
That is Meredith O'Neill, our amazing producer extraordinaire.
It was tenor saxophonist John Coltrane. You're going to start to notice these names here, right? Julian Cannonball Adderley was on alto sax. Pianist Bill Evans and Wynton Kelly show up. Paul Chambers will be on bass, and drummer Jimmy Cobb.
I was probably the first one there because I had to set up the drums. So I had my drums, set them up, and waited till everybody else filed in.
And then, of course, we have Miles Davis on trumpet.
It shows John and Cannon and Miles in top shape at the best of their game.
And so they're all showing up for this project that Miles was assembling them for.
Miles Davis had the awareness and the forethought of looking at people's musical chemistry and selecting the chemistries of different musicians that he knew, even before they played together, he knew it would work.
But there were no prior rehearsals. They knew they were going to be recorded. And Miles said they didn't need any. He said, because I had great musicians in that band, and that's the only way that can work. And Ben, you mentioned like this is kind of how Miles operated, right? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Miles Davis as a band leader was famous both for inventing multiple new styles of jazz, of which Kind of Blue is one, in that it kind of invented something called modal jazz.
Instead of having all of these tremendously sophisticated chord changes or various harmonies, Miles said, instead of doing all that, let's use a mode or a scale.
But he was also present in, which we can talk more about later, the birth of bebop, creating hard bop, and then actually a lot of my academic work was about the quintet he led in the mid-1960s with Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter and Tony Williams and the recently deceased Wayne Shorter, who really sort of pushed jazz to its limits in lots of ways, harmonically, rhythmically, conceptually. And then after that, he invented kind of fusion and electronic music and brought these new approaches to using electronic instruments and playing on one-chord vamps for 30 minutes, which are still, I think, underappreciated and strange and unique. But one constant throughout his career was that he gave very little direction to the musicians who worked for him.
He just came in with little notes that he had. He didn't even have sheet music for that. And the only thing he'd tell me was like, just swing, you know? It was just swing.
And was actually quite famous for hiring people based on their own voice. And there are lots and lots of stories of musicians who would play for him be in his band for 2 or 3 years and would get very frustrated because they would want direction from him. How am I doing? Am I doing this right or not? He's like, it doesn't matter what I think. I don't want to color what you play. Your goal shouldn't be to try and play something that satisfies me. It should be to try and capture your unique voice on your instrument. That's what I hired you for, to be you, not to be a clone of me.
Yeah, and so he's 33 at the time of this when they go to sit down in the studio. How famous was he at this point?
Pretty famous. So Miles is from St. Louis, grew up actually in a middle-class family. His father was a dentist. At 18, he moved to New York, well, ostensibly to go to Juilliard, although he only went, I can't remember if it was a semester or a year, because at night he was leaving Juilliard to go play in jam sessions uptown with Charlie Parker, who is the alto saxophonist, who basically in the 40s was the main figure among a group of musicians who invented a new language in jazz, a language called bebop, which is still basically the fundamental language that contemporary jazz musicians play. It's been taken up and developed and modified in lots of ways, but there's probably not a jazz musician alive who can't sing and play back 20 Charlie Parker solos. That's really the modern vocabulary. So Miles was a kid sneaking out of Juilliard to go play with Charlie Parker at night and the beboppers. And he's on some of those early recordings. You can even hear him as an 18 and 19-year-old, still with his unique, very sparse style. Then in the 50s, he led a group with some of the musicians that are on Kind of Blue, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Paul Chambers, which helped develop a style of music called hard bop, which took the bebop language. Bebop was very fast, very complicated, very modernist music, I'd say, and took that music and slowed it down a little bit, added more blues back in, made it slightly more accessible so that today, if you go to hear a jazz band playing in a jazz club, they're probably playing some version of hard bop. And he was one of the leading lights of that, and his band was one of the best. And so in the jazz world and the New York art world and the wider culture as a whole, he was already one of the most famous people in the music and to some degree in the wider culture.
And this is no relation to Unskinny Bop, a song by Poison, which comes out 30 years later.
Wow. Very impressive. All right.
But it's interesting you mentioned that he really didn't give any or much direction to people, because I was reading about how, like, for these recording sessions, like, He said he didn't write out any of the music for Kind of Blue. Like, he brought in what he called sketches.
I didn't write out the music for Kind of Blue, but brought in sketches because I wanted a lot of spontaneity in the playing.
And he wrote in his autobiography, if you put a musician in a place where he has to do something different from what he does all the time, that's where great art and music happens. And so I'm wondering, like, in other places, these sketches were called outlines. Like, what does that mean to you? Like, what were they looking at? You know what I mean? Because I'm like, are they drawings? Are they like inspirational art? Like, what is that?
Yeah, great question. So sketches means outlines of chords.
Okay.
That they're going to play over. So when a lot of people think of jazz, they imagine it as kind of random spontaneity. I mean, later there was jazz, free jazz that developed that like that, but most jazz is actually not like that at all. It's you start with an existing song form, which is an existing set of chord structures, chords that change in certain amount of measures over certain periods of time that often take an AABA form, whatever. So you take these underlying chord structures that the whole band is playing with, and each soloist makes up melodies that fit with those chords in different ways and imply different things about those chords. They can really run those chords in a very straightforward way. They can add notes that don't fit into those chords in lots of different ways. And then the band responds to that. So there's always a conversation happening, but it's over this underlying structure. Up to Kind of Blue, those song forms actually came from popular songs of the day. So songs from musicals in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, songs from movies. It would not be unlike if now we took, I mean, actually in the last 20 years, a lot of musicians, jazz musicians have taken contemporary music. There are a zillion people who have played Radiohead songs and turned them into jazz, or Beatles songs, or Nirvana songs, or songs that have interesting chord structures usually. And so what he brought for Kind of Blue was something that then came to be called modal jazz. And now I'm finally getting your question. These were very simplified song structures.
He was trying to simplify, but simplify is not really the right word. You know, he was trying to make it clearer. Maybe that's the right word.
So instead of, you know, we have the 1 chord in bar 1 and the 6 chord in bar 2 and the 2 chord in bar 3. Songs were just one long chord for lots of measures in a row. So the first song on the record, So What, is basically D minor for 16 bars, E flat minor for 8 bars, and D minor for 8 more bars. And that's it. So the effect is that when you are playing a song structure with lots of chords, you have this background, which in some ways, I think it was like a railroad track. Like, your goal is to kind of stay on the tracks and play with them in different ways. But if you just follow the chords, they give you a shape and they give you a direction because they generate their own tension and release. That's what chord movements do. They start from somewhere stable, go somewhere unstable, then move back to stability. That's partially what we respond to physiologically in music. As a jazz musician, if you're playing a chord structure that does that, as long as what you play adheres to the main harmonic implications of those chords, your solo will almost by definition generate its own tension and release because the chords you're playing on do that.
Interesting.
What Miles Davis introduced, when you are just playing on one chord for 16 bars, you really don't have that framework. So you have to develop your own story. You have to develop a solo that generates its own tension and release because the canvas is so blank. And for lots of musicians, that's a challenge because with such a blank canvas, it's very easy to play pretty boring stuff and get stale. And so you hear lots of musicians play songs like So What, and they play very standard things. And it's very hard to do anything interesting. And so the challenge for the musicians who came into the studio that day that you were talking about, Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane and pianist Bill Evans, although he was involved in writing some of the music, was all of a sudden there's this crazy open canvas and you have to figure out something new to do with it.
I knew that if you've got some great musicians, they will deal with the situation and play beyond what is there and above where they think they can.
It's the rawest tools you could have. instead of being given a new song form and told, what you can just follow.
The band was a workshop. Miles really kind of talked to everybody and told everybody what to not do, not so much what to do. He never told anybody what to play.
And it's amazing because, it's 5 songs, right, on this album. And the songs are like 9-10 minutes long. And a lot of them are from one take.
The first complete performance of each thing is what you're hearing. If you can get that first fresh take and it's good enough, generally that's, a real good one. And that may account for, some of the success of this album, that all of those takes are the first takes.
Which seems wild that they would get that in one take, and it doesn't sound boring. It's so peaceful sounding and everything. And so when I was reading about how they did this, it was like the first 2 sessions were on March 2nd, and then a couple weeks later on April 22nd, they did their last session. But total, it took them just 9 hours to record the tracks for Kind of Blue. Eventually, it was released on August 17th that same year. But to get to like what you're talking about with like, he didn't give that much direction. What's interesting to me is that like once he's done all of this, he was actually disappointed. Like, okay, he doesn't give everyone much direction, but then he said he considered it a failed experiment. He wrote in his autobiography, and it's like, well, that seems unfair to do, because he said like it didn't represent like what he'd sort of heard in his head prior to recording it. And he also said he didn't expect to make much money from it. And all said and done, like Columbia Records paid Coltrane, Cannonball, and Chambers less than $250 each for the recording. They paid Cobb and Evans even less than $150, and to Wynton Kelly, one of the pianists, less than $75. So it was like, oh my gosh, they really didn't make like anything from this.
So they walk out of the studio. Miles Davis is like, well, that sucked.
Yeah.
And the rest of them are like, that got me some like beer money, like.
Yeah, they got paid scale. Like that was musicians' scale. So for them, it's like, okay, I have a recording date. Go in. Miles puts some music in front of me. We play it. Thanks for the $200. Let me go play my gig that night.
God.
That was that day.
That was exactly right. That was that day. And then on to the next.
Yeah.
And that's not the rest of the story.
Right. Because when Miles Davis talked about this later, like people were like, well, why did you call it Kind of Blue? And he told his biographer, Quincy Troop, that it was sort of a comment on the bittersweet nature of the African-American experience. And reading about this, like he'd had some run-ins with the police and been beaten up like pretty brutally. And I also thought that like it had to do more of like with the tone of the music, because it is like a little bit melancholy.
Why is the Bible the Bible? It's the Bible, why is Kind of Blue kind of blue? It's kind of blue. Like it just is. And it changed the sound of jazz.
And then, when talking about the inspiration for the music, right, because he had this idea of what it would sound like in his head, he was thinking of this memory he had from when he was about 6 years old, walking home from church on this dark dirt road. And he was hearing like the gospel music from church in his head. And he said that's what it was supposed to evoke. But it seemed like unfair he didn't tell that to the 6 other musicians playing with him. I feel like it would have been a little more descriptive, something a little more for them to work from. But that all said, like it ended up being the best-selling jazz record of all time. It sold 5 million copies plus. It's been certified quadruple platinum. It was number 1 on the BBC's 50 Greatest Jazz Albums poll in 2016. That's a lot to say. And number 12 on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 50 greatest albums of all time.
I was just talking to Jimmy Cobb, the last living person from that date. And he was just saying he would never have thought it would have gotten all these accolades.
Yeah, I didn't expect 40 years later that it would be the top-selling jazz record of all time.
But one of the points I wanted to get to with you, Ben, is like, you mentioned in a previous call that like jazz music up until that point was like almost a little bit jarring to listen to for the common listener. And that this was a little bit easier for a broader audience. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Great. Yeah. Okay. So the 1940s and early 1950s, Charlie Parker and his compadres, Dizzy Gillespie on trumpet, Bud Powell on piano, Kenny Clark on drums, and a few other famous people invented this music called bebop, which before the 1940s, jazz had been big band swing music. When you think of, sort of, Duke Ellington had lots of music later, but you think of like the Duke Ellington big band or the Count Basie big band showing up and lots of dancers doing the Lindy Hop in front of them or whatever. That's music that really gets in your body. And the point was to get people dancing. In the 40s, Charlie Parker invented this new music called bebop, which had a very different effect. It was not music meant to be danced to. It was too fast, too rhythmically irregular. It was music meant to be sat down and listened to. And to me, that's the moment when jazz became a modernist art form, and that it moved from something that's supposed to be pleasing that you can sort of lose yourself in to something you actually had to listen to. Charlie Parker played songs very, very quickly, would use lots of notes that were extensions of the chords. And so there were notes people hadn't heard yet. His rhythmic phrasing would be highly irregular. So he would kind of start and stop his phrases in unexpected moments. And the element of being unexpected, of not giving people what they wanted, became a key element of the music. That's the vocabulary that people were drawing from as they developed jazz in the 40s and 50s. What Miles Davis did, he, on a record before Kind of Blue called Milestones, there's a song called Milestones, which is usually considered the first modal jazz song, but Kind of Blue is the moment where he really turned that concept into a full album. Did something very different. And this is why I think it's a great analog for what we do as content creators. But he used those song sketches we were talking about earlier. He slowed things down and created a background which was utterly simple and utterly accessible. And that's one of the reasons I think it's such a popular record, is that no matter how much you know about the music, you can get into it. You can listen to it in the background. You can listen to it in the foreground. And something about that foundation of simplicity gives an opening for all listeners, whether they want to hear sort of modernist irregularity and angularity, or I don't know what the alternative would be. But in that sense, I actually hadn't heard that quote or didn't remember that quote about Miles Davis thinking about gospel music. But I think that's so appropriate because so much Black music comes from the church, and in gospel, the point of music is to engage the audience. Like if you ever go to a Black gospel church, the point is to get people getting up and dancing and clapping and joining in and playing tambourines. And Kind of Blue, the music on Kind of Blue doesn't sound like gospel in that sense. It's not excited. Like the point isn't to get you up and stamping your feet, but it's engaging. Like it's listenable and it's accessible in a way that lots of music hadn't been up to that point.
So he passed away in 1991, and this year he did 115 million streams, Miles Davis, on Spotify, 2.4 million listeners, 11.2 million hours. And I mean, it's crazy. And that's not just Kind of Blue, that's his overall discography. But I always love stories like this that are so fun of, I feel like every single episode of this show ends up being, it almost didn't get made. Well, this is even better than that. It didn't almost not get made, but they thought that it sucked. Yeah. That's pretty great.
It's so crazy.
It's just so great. It's like, oh no, it's actually one of the best, top 10 albums in the history of music. And, and they just went on their merry way. And a couple things that I think are so interesting about that. Number one, that he went into it with an idea in his mind and he left thinking that it didn't get met. And that's like, so we all have that way in whether it's our marketing campaigns or other types of creative endeavors. You have something in your mind. I was listening to the great David Mamet speaking about casting, and he was saying that the problem with casting is that you think of someone in your mind and then nobody meets that expectation when you have the cast. Whereas if you just didn't have anything in mind for who the character would be, you'd be super open to someone really weird and interesting coming in and playing the role. And I think of, the creation process for this is that exact sort of thing, which is like he had this idea in mind. So when it wasn't the way that he wanted, he sort of, was like, oh, well, that was a failed experiment. Whereas like in reality, it ended up being one of the best, albums of all time. And like even the greats, even the best ever, who, as you've, documented here, changed music forever. He didn't know he was sitting on a hit. It's crazy.
I love that quote and I love that idea because the analogy is so apt to casting in a movie. I think that's so great. In that, I think one of the byproducts of Miles having created such simple sketches for people to solo on was that you really hear the unique individual voices of each musician. One of the wonderful things about this record is that you hear each musician in it doing something so different from the others. Even if you just listen to the first song, So What, Miles comes in.
Then Miles plays beep, boop, doo. Simplest notes. You can't get any simpler than that.
And Miles was famous for having a very sparse style, very much interested in playing space. And for him, he was very actively thinking about how to play the silence and the space between notes as much as he was playing the actual notes. So he was super minimalist, would play one or two notes, but they would be absolutely beautiful and absolutely brilliant, and took a sort of courage to play those one or two notes that very few musicians have. It's much easier to play a lot of notes and hope you get something right. Just like now, I am just talking endlessly and hope that I hit something interesting. It's much harder to have that one pithy statement and let it hang there. And then he's followed by John Coltrane, who was at that moment in his career starting to develop something that was called sheets of sound. It was almost the diametric opposite approach to what Miles was doing, and that Coltrane was trying to play every note a chord implied. So he would play note after note after note after note very, very quickly. I almost think of the sheets of sound as the version of Duchamp's painting A Nude Descending a Staircase, or some of the Picasso paintings where he was trying to capture 8 different perspectives on something at once in a single frame. That's what Coltrane's sheets of sound playing was like. He's trying to capture 8 different ways to think about this chord, all in the space of 4 beats. And so he just plays note after note and goes up and down his horn. And so the yin and yang between Miles playing super sparsely, but hitting just the right note, and Coltrane with the maximalist approach, I think is only possible because of this open foundation that Miles Davis wrote for the record, that he brought in for those musicians to play on. And yeah, we talk about Mamet, like a screenwriter or a director can go in and have a script and imagine how these lines are going to be read. But if they go in with no idea and just let actors bring their own interpretation, in some ways you get a much more fruitful, collaborative, sometimes weirder, but often much more collective result.
Meredith, I think in this case, you're the Miles and I'm Coltrane. more of the maximalist of the show.
I'll take it.
Well, I think it's also, I love the quote, if you put a musician in a place where he has to do something different from what he does all the time, that's where great art and music happens. I think it's interesting that Miles got put in a place that he had to do something different, and then it ended up making great art and music. And so, he had a dose of his own medicine there, which is pretty funny. And again, that's what made it great. And if you had given them the note ahead of time, just if you had said, like, make this like gospel music, I don't know what the note would be. But if he had said that at the beginning, it's a totally different thing. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, who knows? There's only one life that we live in this world. But it's just fascinating, and it's a great lesson.
I also think a lot of people, when they hear about jazz and hear about improvisation, imagine that it's this sort of weird artistic ability that you have or don't have. And I think it's worth pointing out that what happens in jazz improvisation is in some ways no different from what happens when you're just having a conversation with someone. You have a topic that the conversation is loosely about, but you often have no idea what you're going to say next. You have no idea what the person you're talking to is going to say next, and it goes where it goes. And if you are a somewhat skillful conversationalist, you can sustain that conversation for 5 or 10 or 20 minutes and keep it interesting. And there are sort of guidelines for what counts as an interesting statement. And these are all implied, but we live that sort of improvisation in our day-to-day lives far more than we imagine. Anyway, so the other thing I was going to say is the point you made about putting musicians in a place where they have to do something different from what they do all the time. And if he had gotten together with them the week before and rehearsed 5 times before coming in, it would have been a very different result. in some ways, Miles held true to the idea that jazz is a spontaneous music, that is created in the moment and is made differently every single time. Ideally, if a jazz performance sounds rehearsed, then it's failing because it's not attentive to what is happening in the moment and how each musician is feeling and what sounds they're hearing in their heads and what they're hearing from each other and the way they respond to each other. Again, just like, you may come back to the same topics and conversations with your friends. If you say the exact same things every time you have a conversation, it gets pretty boring. So jazz is a way to sort of return to the same topic, but come up with new things to say about it every single time. And the idea that he went in without rehearsals, without even telling the musicians what the music was going to look like, just put it in front of them and said, let's go, really showed how much he valued the spontaneity that's at the heart of this kind of music. And even though he thought the results sucked, he still put it out and was willing to live with it in one capacity or another. I think that's something that's really captured. I think whether people are aware of the spontaneity involved or not, I think that true spontaneity really grabs people on a gut level. Okay, three marketing lessons. Okay, so the first one is about that approach of having a simple foundation. I think to me that is something I've really tried to hold to for most of my writing life and most of my content marketing life, in that what people respond to in Kind of Blue, and I think what people often respond to best in good content, is a simple, clear, open, direct message. I think a lot of companies want to come in and start by getting very complex and talking about the scenario and the nuances of their solution and the technical advantages their product offers, which is fine. But I think those messages come across much clearer when they're built over a very simple, direct, clear foundation. When the foundation is simple and clear and communicable, you can add complexity to it and overlay new messages that give more detail. But I think it's worth it in the content world for most companies to think about what's your fundamental message, whether that's one sentence or one paragraph or 4 words. What's the thing that people will respond to that explains what you do and why it matters in a unique way? And it's very hard to get to. I don't think many companies do it well. It's very easy to come up with something that's too abstract to be meaningful.
So abstract. I totally agree. So many companies, it's just like, hey, our mission is to help people everywhere in the world. It's like, well, isn't that every company, right? Like, yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Or like, better ROI in your business. It's like, yes, that's what a business is supposed to do. I mean, it's not wrong, but it tells the person very little about how. And that's what really matters, and who you're talking to. And so one of my lessons is that you should always strive to create a simple, communicable foundation that ideally everyone in the company can embody. And when the audience receives it, understands right away. And then you build complexity on top of that. The second lesson I get is that mood and feeling matter as much as detail. Kind of Blue has that impact on you because of the way it sounds, and you're not listening to every single note, and you're not listening to Coltrane saying, oh, he played a flat 13 there. Whoa, that's wild. It impacted you on a sort of deeper, more emotional level. And we often forget that as content writers, that our audience are not robotic automatons. They're people, and we want to hit their emotions. And that's where you reach people.
The kids would say it's a vibe.
It's a vibe.
But seriously, it is a great lesson, because how many pieces of content or an event that you did or a webinar or your podcast or whatever it is quote unquote a vibe, right? Like, I always use these examples where you look back at like early days Dreamforce or things like that, where like the vibes were at an all-time high. That's why people talked about it. That's why they told their friends about it. That's why for $1,200 a ticket, you could convince people that like, this is the best thing I've done, or whatever. And so much of the stuff we have is vibeless. It's just, it's boring, it's rote, it's nothing. It doesn't fit in or stand out. It's just kind of nothingness. It definitely doesn't make you stomp your feet. It doesn't make you, get up and yell or shake a tambourine. And it doesn't make you feel any type of feelings. And like, at the end of the day, like, that's what you should be doing. Like, we're supposed to make people feel feelings, whether it's like embarrassed that they don't know, how to use AI yet, or, happy that their marketing team is ahead of the curve, or excited about, new possibilities, or smarter, or whatever it is. There's just so many things that we want people to feel, and so much that we create does not make any of that happen.
I think that is so true. And I wonder how many marketers, not just content marketers, but start out with any initiative they're doing saying, what are the emotions we want to evoke here? And use that as a North Star. I mean, not that I do that every time, but I think it's an interesting approach. Yeah, go ahead.
It's why we're making the show, right? I don't do that every time.
Yeah.
But it should be. Speaking of David Mamet, there's a great interview where he did after he came out with one of his plays. I forget which one it was. And people were getting fights in the lobby of the play because it was a very charged play. And people would be like, it was the woman's fault. It's the man's fault. And like, literally the people were getting in fights. And there's a great quote where he's sort of like, people were getting in fights. Like, how great is that? And, not because he's, encouraging fighting, but just because that it makes them feel such a way that they could identify with a character or feel, those sort of things. He's a master at that. But like, Miles Davis is obviously one of the great masters of jazz. And, that's part of the thing, right? It's like you're making people feel something. And with this album, making the mainstream feel it, not just sort of the niche.
Yeah, Duke Ellington famously said, as many people know, his famous song called It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing. And I think there's a pretty deep lesson there in that lots of people imagine jazz as this like hyper musical, complex language where you have to know lots about chords and notes and rhythms and melodies. And in some ways you do, but really the point is to swing. It's the point. The point is to get people to tap their feet and snap their fingers without even knowing they're doing it. So that's one of my favorite things. Like when I go hear a jazz or really any kind of music with friends, if we're in a club sitting there talking, having a drink, and there's a band playing in the background, I will sometimes stop and look at how many of my friends are tapping their feet or tapping the table without even knowing it. And if all of them are doing it, then the band is doing something right. Whether you're listening to the complex harmonies they're playing or not, you got to hit people on a gut level. And the other lesson I take from this is that, like jazz, content is the team activity. I think one of the great things about Kind of Blue, as we've talked about, is that there's room for lots of individual voices, and it only works because you have Miles Davis with his minimalist approach and John Coltrane with his maximalist approach. And then you have Cannonball Adderley, who mixes bebop and blues with a sweet tone on his alto sax. And then you have Bill Evans, the pianist, who's playing chords that he stole from French composers like Debussy and Ravel.
You can't say what the stronger influence is because Miles is the leader, and of course the way he played set the tone. But the harmony, or in this case, lack of harmony, but of substitute type harmony that is so prevalent on Kind of Blue, is definitely Bill Evans.
All of those voices are kind of given equal weight on this record in a way that doesn't happen. And I think we think about representing our company through our content, it's worth recognizing that there are plenty of voices across the company, and they all often, although they're aligned around a similar goal, have different ways of expressing what's important. And so your product team or your sales team or your C-suite or your customer success team might have different takes on what you do and why it's important and why it matters for the audience, or different members of the audience or different members of the buying committee. And it's worth remembering that it's okay to vary the voice and story you're telling, as long as you have a fundamental story that is simple and clear. What's on top of it involves often sort of orchestrating these different voices in a way that hits people in different ways and allows for nuance and complexity to be added to your story.
My takeaway here is that first off, this was an experiment, one that Miles deemed a failed experiment afterwards that ended up being iconic. And that his experiment was to take a bunch of the best people, the most talented people that he knew, put them in a room for essentially 9 hours, right? Over 2 sessions, but essentially over 9 hours, and push them out of their comfort zone and give them a very simple premise, to your point, Ben, and see what they could make together, right? And it was wildly successful.
Kind of Blue becomes successful immediately. He's becoming a popular mainstream star. The Columbia deal gets his music into mainstream America like never before.
And there's no rehearsals. There's no prep except for the prep of their entire lifetimes leading up to that point of being great and, seeking greatness and seeking to be great musicians. And I think there's just so much wisdom in that. And I think you could replace musician with marketer in almost every single one of these quotes. And I think this would be a good idea for marketing teams to do. I think the idea of taking the data person and shoving them in a content role and a content person and shoving them in a data role on your marketing team, like all sorts of things like that. I love those things. Lock people in the room, tell them they have 4 hours, and when they come out, they better have something great. And I think that there's more of that. I can't remember if I told you this, Ben, but I started writing, our company newsletter, and I sort of write it as a story now instead of what I used to do. And it's not even a newsletter really at all. But I sit down with Colin, our head of content strategy, and we sit down for an hour. If I can't write it in the hour, then whatever I'm done with at that hour, that's going live. And boy, does pressure form the diamond, It's just there's so much more stuff of that we could be doing with our teams rather than the opposite, which is let's have 15 meetings to make sure that we're all on the same page about this thing and this thing and this thing. And it's we know the mission of the company, we know our goal as a marketing team, and off of that simple premise, we can go make anything we want. What should we go make?
God, I love that. What a wonderful idea. Good for you. And you're right. It so rarely happens in that way. There's always 7 meetings and 12 rounds of review and 15 people who need to weigh in on this thing. And at the end, it's if pressure makes the diamond, often what happens is that all these rounds of review end up sanding the diamond down to a formless rock. And I think you're so right that there's something about having a goal and putting all your energy and attention towards that thing for a limited period of time and just going for it and then putting it out there. And it's probably not going to break the business.
No.
But right, Miles thought this was a failure. He didn't run it by every executive to make sure it was good. They put it out there. And I think, I embrace the experimental is part of what I'm picking up from you, I think.
Yeah. And your audience has a vote, right? The rest of the world got to decide whether or not this was a failed experiment. And now, millions and millions and millions of people listen every year for the past 50, 60 years. It's crazy. Okay, switching gears to Heap. Tell us a little bit how you think about your content strategy and how it fits into your marketing strategy.
Yeah, it changes over time. To me, a content strategy is the amalgamation of 2 big inputs. One input is business goals, what you're trying to do as a business and what you're trying to do as a marketing org, whom you're trying to talk to, what you're trying to get them to do, what activities you want them to take at each step of their journey to achieve whatever metrics you're working towards as a marketing team, whether that's you're trying to get MQLs or you're trying to get leads or you're trying to get pipeline or you're trying to get brand awareness. So one set of inputs is what do you want people to ultimately do as a business? What do you need as a business? And then the other set of inputs is what's your story? What's the company's story? And what are the main narratives you want to hit? And so for me, creating a content strategy involves taking both those inputs, marrying them to a set of tactics. Then you start thinking about what are the formats you want to deliver, what are the channels you want to deliver. Should you make ebooks? Should you make videos? Should you double down on social media? Do you do lots of own media or earn media? What's the balance there? How much paid versus organic? All those tactical decisions. And then what's the story that is told at each moment for each member of the audience that you're trying to reach? And Heap, it's changed over the years as the company has grown, as we've added products, whatnot. What I have found most successful in the last 5 years are a few things and sort of different streams. Our most successful downloaded pieces of content pretty consistently over the last 5 years have been simple worksheets and guides to people doing their jobs better. We've written lots of long ebooks. Those do fine. Most often it's a simple, look, you want to run this kind of meeting? Here's a downloadable 2-page worksheet you can use to run that meeting. He was an analytics company, so a lot of it is how do you measure this thing? What things should you measure? What's the first step if you want to start becoming more data-driven? Here are 3 worksheets that you can get together with your team. Fill these out, and you will actually have a pretty good template for making more data-driven decisions. So those sorts of things have done extraordinarily well. On the other side have been things that we've just done that were more creative. So we made a comic book about digital insights and why they're important. That did really well. We talked about Heap's approach to collecting data versus other companies' approaches to collecting data. We made something called a fight guide, which was supposed to be like a boxing card that went through each round and had all these animations. People really responded to that. So I guess the long-term lessons I've gotten is people either respond to things that are sort of novel and interesting and hit the emotions, as we've been talking about, something they haven't seen before, or are simple and useful and don't necessarily try and sell a product to them, but just make their lives easier. And doing that second thing helps turn your company from a group of people who are trying to sell something to you to a trusted advisor, like a group of people who knows what problems you face in your job and is trying to make things better and easier for you.
Tell me about the comic book. How did it work out?
Yeah, credit where credit is due. That was inspired by a friend of mine. I saw he did a comic book on his site. So I said, I'm going to steal that idea. I guess not that I'm a great artist, but good artists borrow, great artists steal. And so we realized that at that point of time in our company's development, we had to do more work on if you think about, there's the very famous sort of 2-step pitch in marketing, which is why do you need this kind of thing in general? And then why do you need our specific version of that thing? A lot of people were getting hung up on step 1. Like, why do they need this kind of thing in general? And so we wrote lots of ebooks and we gave the sales team lots of decks, and they made their own. They have lots of inputs into lots of ideas about, like, why do you need product analytics in the first place? And we thought, well, let's try and make something accessible. So we worked with a design agency and we spent a few months on it. And we made about a 10-page comic book talking about why digital insights or why product analytics is important and how the world is changing and what you need it. And I think it ended up being just fun and readable and accessible. Our audience loved it. Our sales team loved it. You can hand it to all your relatives when they say, what does this tech company do? You hand them that. They're like, oh, I see what you do and why it's important. We ended up giving it to every employee in the company in our Christmas gift box to them so that they could help get the company story. And I think it really helped tell the story of what Heap was and why it was important in a new, compelling, understandable way.
It's cool. It's really cool. It's very well done. And I'm glad y'all did it because it's great. I guess why not make more of those? Why not do more stuff like that?
I mean, it's resource intensive and it also really needs buy-in from leadership, both marketing leadership and company leadership. Often, as lots of guests to this show have shared, the higher you go up the chain, the more conservative people tend to get about things because they don't want to take risks, which is fine. Very understandable. You have this company, you don't want to do anything that would jeopardize it. But yeah, that can end up being a roadblock to really innovating both in the product and on the marketing side, I think. So I think more companies should do things like that. I look forward to doing more things like that.
What's your best piece of advice for someone who is a head of content, head of brand, VP of content, VP of brand, and is trying to figure it all out?
I think my best advice is something from what we've been talking about all episode about Miles Davis's approach, which is don't be afraid to leave room for spontaneity. That's a crucial component of producing something good. We are all extraordinarily busy. Our days are really full. We have massive goals to hit. It's very easy to ignore that, but sometimes the best marketing comes from carving out time for free-form group thinking, brainstorming, coming up with ideas that are new and off the wall, having that be a prompt. I'm a big fan of the come up with 1,000 ideas, knowing 998 of them are going to be awful. You pick the 2 that are good, but you only get to those 2 by going through the other 998. And I think anyone who works on the creative side of marketing it behooves them to stay aware of the need for that space for freeform thinking. Not all the time, but regularly.
Fantastic having you on the show. Great talking, Miles Davis, jazz, and your background. Any final thoughts? Anything to plug?
No, it's been an absolute joy. You're a great interviewer and a great interlocutor.
Well, it's been wonderful chatting, and we'll have to talk again soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
Well, that's it for today. I hope you got some good ideas for your B2B content. Thank you for listening to Remarkable. I'm Ian Faison, CEO of Caspian Studios. Remarkable is created by the team at Caspian Studios, B2B podcast as a service. Caspian also creates fiction series for B2B companies, so if you want a business thriller, you can learn more at caspianstudios.com. Hollywood-style storytelling for B2B. And in today's episode, you heard from myself, Ian Faison, and Meredith O'Neill, senior producer here at Caspian Studios. Remarkable was produced this week by Meredith O'Neill, mixed by Scott Goodrich, and our theme song is Solomon by Falak. Be remarkable and rise above the noise.